In the year 1860, Willowby Lane was a place of oil lamps, ticking clocks, and the rustle of bonnets beneath shuttered windows. Tucked behind hedgerows and stone walls in the English countryside, it was a sleepy village in the most literal sense. The people of Willowby had a peculiar relationship with sleep, one shaped by the rhythms of nature, the fear of fire, and the persistence of old superstitions. In a small brick cottage with ivy creeping up the chimney stack, 11-year-old Clara Mallory lay beneath a heavy woolen quilt, wide-eyed and listening. The sounds of the house settling were familiar to her now, the creak of timber above her room, the hiss of coals cooling in the stove, and the steady breath of her mother in the adjacent room. Clara did not expect to sleep through the night. Nobody in Willowby did. People here did not slumber in one long stretch. They took what was called first sleep, usually from around 8 or 9 in the evening, until just past midnight. Then came the watch, an hour or two of quiet wakefulness, when the fire was stoked, the chamber pot emptied, prayers whispered, and sometimes letters written or mending done. After that came second sleep, which carried people gently to morning. Tonight, Clara had awoken just before the church bell at St. Martin's tolled 1. She rose without a candle, her eyes adjusting to the silver light of the half-moon streaming through the curtain gap. In her stockings and nightdress, she padded softly across the cold floorboards to her mother's room. Mrs. Mallory sat in her rocking chair by the hearth, stitching a hem with small, practiced movements. She looked up and smiled faintly, her eyes rimmed with weariness. "Couldn't sleep?" she asked. Clara shook her head. "I had the dream. Again, the one where I wake up outside. But I never remember walking out." Her mother's hands paused in mid-stitch. "Just a dream, darling. You're safe, always." Clara watched the firelight dance across the floor. "Do you think Papa had dreams like that, when he was away in the Crimea?" Mrs. Mallory blinked slowly, her gaze drifting to the mantelpiece, where a small daguerreotype of her husband stood in a wooden frame. He had died 4 years earlier, felled not by a bullet, but by fever in a hospital tent far from home. "I think your father dreamed of this house, of coming home. I think he held us in his mind when he was far away." Silence settled between them, soft and not unwelcome. In other houses along the lane, similar scenes played out. Mr. Penworthy, the retired schoolmaster, used his waking hours to read the Psalms by candlelight. 2 doors down, the Rudge twins, 16 and mischievous, would sneak down to the kitchen to steal cold meat pies and whisper gossip. The blacksmith's wife, Mrs. Talbot, often used the time to tend to her baby, who was colicky and loud, filling the cottage with tiny war cries that echoed down the lane. The people of Willowby believed that this waking time in the middle of the night was not an interruption, but a blessing. The mind was clearer, they said. Thoughts were softer. Secrets shared at that hour felt protected somehow, swaddled in the hush between midnight and dawn. Clara went to the window. The frost had painted fine patterns on the glass. She traced a fern-like swirl with her finger and looked out. A lantern moved along the lane. It was Amos Whitby, the night watchman, swinging his bell gently as he passed. From house to house, 3 o'clock, and all is well, he called, as was his custom. Mr. Whitby had once been a sailor, and still wore a navy peacoat, brass buttons glinting in the moonlight. His round face was usually pink with cold, and his beard held the scent of tobacco. Children were both fascinated and slightly afraid of him. Some believed he had the power to see who was awake during the watch, and who was not. Clara watched until his lantern bobbed out of sight. Her mother motioned her back to the hearth. "Come sit. Your feet must be freezing." She did as told, tucking her toes near the embers. "Why doesn't everyone sleep through, like in the books?" Her mother smoothed a strand of hair behind Clara's ear. "People used to, or maybe they didn't. No one really knows. But we wake up in the night because our bodies remember something older than books." "Like what?" "Like fire needing tending. Like wolves near the door. Like the stars." Clara wasn't sure she believed in wolves, but she liked the idea that stars had something to say to sleepers. Outside, an owl called softly. Inside, the clock struck 3:30. "Come on," her mother whispered. "Back to bed. Second sleep is best for dreams." Clara stood and tiptoed back into her room, sliding under the quilt, now faintly warm from her earlier nap. She closed her eyes, listening once more to the rhythm of the house. The quiet crackle of the last log burning low, and the breath of her mother returning to her own rest. Sleep came easier this time, but outside, in the fields just beyond the village, something stirred in the frost. A figure in a long coat moved along the hedgerow, his boots silent on the frozen ground. He carried no lantern and watched the windows with a careful, measuring gaze. And in the next cottage over, a letter set on the table, half finished. The ink still wet, a letter that would, in time, unravel the peaceful nights of Willowby Lane, forever. The morning came with fog. Willowby Lane awoke slowly, as it always did, under a blanket of mist that blurred the hedges and muffled the hooves of passing carts. Chimneys breathed wisps of smoke into the grey sky, and the crows, bold and busy, flapped noisily across the tilled fields. In the Mallory house, Clara stirred beneath her quilt. Her eyes fluttered open not to birdsong, but to a quiet tapping. At first, she thought it was the branches against the window. But it was too precise, rhythmic, like knuckles. She sat up, heart quickening. The knocking came again, this time louder. Before she could rise, her mother appeared in the doorway, wrapped in her wool shawl. "It's Constable Grigg," she said, her voice low. "He says there's something I ought to see." Clara slipped into her dress and boots, leaving her braids loose and her questions unspoken. She followed her mother through the narrow hallway. To the front door, Constable Grigg stood on the stone step with his cap in his hand, and his mustache twitched with concern. Behind him, the fog coiled in the lane like breath. "Mrs. Mallory, I regret the early hour, but there's been some trouble up by the footpath near Stag's Hollow." "What sort of trouble?" she asked. "I'd rather you saw for yourself. It's not far." Clara was certain she wouldn't be allowed to come, but her mother hesitated for only a moment before nodding. The three of them walked down the lane, past familiar cottages with thatched roofs and sleeping cats in windowsills. A few neighbors peered through lace curtains, watching the procession but not opening their doors. Word had already begun to ripple through the village like wind through wheat. They passed the blacksmith's house. Mrs. Talbot stood outside with her baby in her arms, looking pale. "Found it just after dawn," she murmured. "Was walking to the well. Thought it was a scarecrow at first." At the edge of the field, just beyond the last gate, stood the hollow. Once, many years ago, it had been a meeting place for midsummer dancing and harvest songs. Now, it was rarely used, save by boys daring each other at dusk, or by lovers on stolen walks. In the center of the hollow stood a crude post, no taller than a man's chest, and tied to it, arms slumped and head down, was a bundle of clothes that might once have been a person as they approached. Clara could see it clearly. A man, slumped but still upright, his coat frozen stiff, and blood dried into the wool like ink on paper. Constable Grigg crouched beside the figure, checking the neck, then stood, dead, certainly. "Sometime after midnight. Who is he?" Mrs. Mallory asked. "Not sure. Doesn't match anyone local. We'll ask Whitby, see if he saw anything during the night watch." Clara took a step forward. Something about the man's boots, worn but not rural, and the cuff of his coat, city-tailored, unsettled her. Mrs. Mallory placed a hand on Clara's shoulder. "Come, you've seen enough." They walked back slowly, the frost crunching beneath their feet, the still air heavy with unasked questions. By the time they reached home, word had spread in full. Children were kept inside, shutters drawn despite the rising sun, and the village, so proud of its gentle rhythms, found itself twitching at every creak and knock-dot that evening. The fire in the Mallory hearth was lit earlier than usual. Clara sat curled in the armchair, watching her mother spoon tea leaves into the pot with a firmer hand than usual. "Was it a thief?" she asked. "I don't know." "Do you think he was following someone? Maybe someone from Willowby?" Her mother looked over the rim of her cup. "It's not our business, Clara." But the girl could tell the words were a shield, not a belief. That night, Clara lay awake longer than usual. Her first sleep came late and shallow. When she woke for the watch, the fire had burned low. The windows glinted with moonlight. Something pressed at the edges of her thoughts, like a whisper she couldn't quite hear. She rose and wandered into the parlor. Her mother wasn't there. The hearth was cold. The teacup from earlier still sat on the table, untouched. A draft stirred the curtains. Clara turned toward the back door. It was unlatched, swinging gently on its hinges. Outside, the village was silent. The moon hung low behind thin clouds, and the lane shimmered faintly with frost. Clara pulled on her shawl and stepped out. She found her mother standing in the garden, barefoot, her eyes fixed on the orchard beyond the gate. "Mother, Clara," whispered Mrs. Mallory, turned slowly, as though waking from a deep thought. Her face was pale. "I had the dream again," she said. "The one your father described in his letters from the Crimea." Clara stepped closer, uncertain. "What dream?" "That someone was walking through the house, quiet as a shadow, and every door they passed unlocked itself. A breeze swept through the trees, rattling the dead branches." "There's something wrong here," her mother continued. "Something came with that man, or before him." The next morning, the constable returned. "Found something in the dead man's coat," he said, holding out a letter, sealed with wax, addressed to a Mrs. Evelyn Mallory. Mrs. Mallory took it without blinking. The wax was unbroken. The paper bore a city mark. London. Clara watched as her mother broke the seal. Inside was a single sheet, a name, a date, a sentence. "I saw what he buried beneath the orchard. It's not dead. It never was." Mrs. Mallory folded the paper and placed it on the mantel. "That's enough now, Constable. Thank you." When he left, she locked the door behind him. Clara stared at the letter. "What does it mean?" Her mother didn't answer. That evening, during the watch, Clara did not find her mother in the chair by the fire. She found her in the orchard, digging. The earth was stiff and frozen, but a shovel lay nearby. A shallow hole yawned in the center of the field. Clara stood beside her in silence. Together they looked down. Something wrapped in cloth, blackened with age, lay half buried in the dirt, a box, or perhaps a bundle. Her mother knelt and pulled it free with shaking hands. Inside were bones, small, not animal. The cloth that wrapped them bore the insignia of the 11th Regiment, her father's unit. Clara staggered back. "Is that—" "No," her mother said quickly. "No, this is older, much older." From beneath the cloth, something metallic clinked against the wood. A coin, not a common one. Clara recognized the symbol, the same strange sigil carved into the church bell at St. Martin's. The one the older boys said had been there since the plague years. Her mother's voice dropped. "He brought this home. I told him not to, but he said it had to be buried, that it was part of the oath." Oath. Mrs. Mallory pressed her hands to her face. When the men came back from Crimea, most brought wounds. Some brought medals. He brought this, and he said they'd all been sworn to keep it hidden. That if it ever came above ground, it would call the rest. Clara's hands trembled. The rest of what? Her mother didn't answer. She replaced the bones gently, closed the box, and began covering it with earth again, that night. No one slept in Willowby Lane. The next day, Amos Whitby was found at the edge of town. His lantern was still lit. His face was turned skyward, his eyes wide open. They said he had died of fright. They buried him quickly. No one lingered, and at night, people began to do things differently. Fires were kept burning longer. Salt was placed at windows. Knives were hidden beneath pillows. The practice of the watch changed too. No longer a time of quiet reflection. It became a vigil. People gathered in pairs. Doors were bolted. Children slept in their parents' arms. And Clara Mallory, no longer a child but not yet a woman, stood at her window each night, watching, waiting. She had not dreamed since that night in the orchard. Her mother did, though. Every night, she would wake with a gasp, or a cry, or a whisper. "They're coming," she said once, her voice hoarse. "They follow the one who forgot the oath." And so Willowby Lane kept its watch, until one night, just before the frost gave way to spring, Clara awoke, not to the usual quiet, but to the sound of singing, soft, lilting, and terribly old. It came from the hollow, and this time, the moon was full. The news of Jacob Trigg's disappearance spread through Willowby Lane like fire catching on dry thatch. By mid-morning, mothers were calling their children in from the fields, and shutters were drawn tighter than usual, despite the cloudless sky. No one had seen Jacob since the previous night's watch, and no one could say for sure when or how he vanished. Amos Whitby, the night watchman, had been summoned to the vicarage, where Reverend Underwood paced in his dressing gown, hair disheveled, a kettle steaming untouched by the hearth. "You saw nothing?" the Reverend asked, his hands clasped behind his back. Amos tugged on his beard. "I walked past their house just after 2, called the hour, as I always do. Light was out. No sound. Dog didn't even bark. They say the front door was found unlatched." Amos nodded. "But the ground's dry. No prints, no scuffle. He might have wandered off himself. Or been taken," the Reverend said quietly. "This isn't the first time something's stirred during the watch. You remember old Hugh Stanning's sheep gone missing, and that boy from Harrow Lane 2 winters ago?" "Aye, but those were explained in the end, were they?" the Reverend muttered. He moved to the window, staring out at the stone walls and hedgerows. "There's a pattern, Amos. Every incident tied to the watch hours." Amos frowned. "You think it's cursed?" "I think," said the Reverend, "that something walks when we wake." That night, Clara Mallory sat by the hearth again, but this time her mother was not stitching. She sat in silence, a cup of cold tea in her lap, watching the flames shift color as they devoured the last of the kindling. "Do you think he ran away?" Clara asked softly. Mrs. Mallory didn't answer at first. Then, after a long pause, she said, "He was frightened of the dark. Jacob wouldn't even fetch coal without a lantern. He wouldn't have gone outside willingly." Clara hesitated. "Could it be sleepwalking, like the dreams I have?" Her mother's expression changed. Not alarm, but something more subtle, like recognition tinged with dread. "You've never left the house, Clara," she said gently. "Dreams aren't always doorways, but what if they are?" Mrs. Mallory stood and checked the windows for the 3rd time that night. Then she placed the fire iron across the front door handle. "What's that for?" Clara asked. "It's an old trick. Cold iron wards off mischief," she said, brushing soot from her hands. "Just in case." "Just in case, what?" Mrs. Mallory offered a wan smile. "Go back to bed. Try to dream only pleasant things." Clara lay awake for a long while, staring at the ceiling. She could feel something in the air that didn't belong, like the world was holding its breath. Elsewhere, on Willowby Lane, another house stirred. Behind the glass windows of the Penworthy cottage, the old schoolmaster sat with his journal. Normally a man of order and discipline, Mr. Penworthy now trembled as he wrote, his quill scratching uneven lines across the page. February 3rd, watch hour. There is a noise at the back wall again. 2nd time this week. It sounds like someone dragging something heavy along the stone, but I've seen nothing. Last night, I woke not on the chair, but standing at the garden gate. I do not remember leaving my room. I fear something has returned." He dipped the pen once more, but froze mid-sentence. The noise had come again faint, but deliberate as scraping, like nails across brick. He moved to the back door, candle in hand, and slowly opened it. Nothing but the wind. The garden was still, but the row of turnips he'd planted weeks ago had been torn out roots clean. No claw marks, no prints, and in the soil, a half-buried ring, silver and dull, engraved with an image of an open eye. By the next evening, Willowby Lane had changed. Lanterns burned through the night. Mr. Talbot, the blacksmith, nailed horseshoes above every threshold. Mrs. Rudge went door to door, passing out sachets of herbs and muttering charms her grandmother had whispered to her in Romany. Before she died, Amos Whitby, once content to stroll with his belle, now carried a musket over one shoulder and a flask of rum at his hip. But fear, once kindled, spreads quick, and not everyone trusted iron or herbs to keep nightmares at bay. In the attic of their cottage, Clara found something strange. She'd been searching for her father's old compass when she found a locked box beneath a floorboard. Its wood was dark, oiled, and warm to the touch, as if it had been sitting in sunlight. She ran her hand along the lid. A faded emblem was etched there, a crescent moon cradling a sleeping eye. The key was already in the lock dot inside. She found a leather-bound notebook and a pouch of dried leaves that smelled like sweetgrass and ashdot. The notebook was her father's. January 1855. Crimea. The sleep here is not whole. We rise in the night as if called, but no trumpet sounds. Something walks the trenches unseen. It waits during second sleep. They say some soldiers vanish, their beds warm, their boots untouched. Another entry scrawled later. The men say it comes to the ones who dream too deeply, that it feeds on the watch hour. I've begun keeping the fire lit all night, and I've made the sign, just as the old woman told me. Perhaps it will see I'm not worth the bother. Below the note was a drawing, a crude but familiar one. An open eye in the center of a crescent moon. Clara's heart thudded. She looked again at the dried leaves in the pouch and at the handwriting in the margins. Burn these at the watch hour. Leave the window open. It hates clean smoke. That night, Clara waited. When the bell rang 2 o'clock, she rose from bed and went to the hearth. The fire was still low, but glowing. She threw a pinch of the dried leaves into the embers. They sparked and hissed, releasing a scent that reminded her of summer and the forest. She opened the window. Cold air rushed in, curling around her bare feet. Outside, the lane was quiet. Then she saw it. At first it looked like a shadow stretched too tall, but as her eyes adjusted, she realized it had shape of form like a man draped in smoke, with no eyes, just sockets that flickered like coals. It walked down the lane, pausing before each house, as if sniffing the air. It stopped at the Penworthy cottage. It turned its head toward Clara's window, but when the clean smoke drifted out, the creature shuddered and vanished. Clara closed the window, breath catching in her throat. Below, her mother stirred. "Clara," she called. Clara backed away from the hearth. Just getting water," she lied. But inside her pocket, she now carried the pouch of leaves, and in her heart, she knew this was not just a strange dream or an old superstition. The watch hour was being watched. Clara Mallory was no longer afraid. She was curious. A cold, precise kind of curiosity that made her stare at ordinary things and wonder what they truly were. She lit the hearth again, just after supper. Her mother, exhausted from a day of haggling with the baker and patching Mrs. Rudge's coat for coin, dozed in the chair by the fire. Outside, the wind clawed against the shutters, but it didn't rattle Clara anymore. She had laid the notebook open on the kitchen table, weighed down with her father's old compass. The ink had faded in places, but the words were there, dark and insistent. Second sleep is the dangerous time. First, the mind drifts, then it sinks. That's when it notices. The thing from the trench, it isn't a ghost. It isn't a dream. It's the Watcher. We gave it a name once, just to make it easier. The Hollow Man. Clara repeated it in her head. The Hollow Man. She touched the dry herb pouch beside the compass. That smoke had saved her. She had no doubt of it now, and someone needed to know. Someone besides her, at school. She'd learned that knowledge. When left in one mind too long, spoiled like meat. So she stuffed the notebook into her coat and walked to the Penworthy cottage. Mr. Penworthy answered the door in his nightshirt, eyes bleary, candle trembling in his hand. "Miss Mallory, is your mother ill?" "No, sir. It's about the other night." He frowned. "You're not to be out so late. It's near the watch hour." "I know. Please. You've seen it, haven't you?" The candlelight flickered across his face. In the hollows beneath his eyes, Clara saw truth. He stepped aside, quickly. The inside of the cottage was neater than she expected. Not a single book out of place, every map pinned square to the wall. But the smell of smoke and copper lingered in the corners. Clara handed him the notebook. He read in silence for several minutes, lips twitching as he moved from page to page. When he closed it, he said, "Your father knew what I suspected, that this thing isn't random. It feeds on dreams, on the distance between sleep and waking, on the soft part of the mind. It doesn't want the body, just the echo of it." But why only now? Why here? Penworthy sat down slowly. "During the war, when your father was away, I was in London, We studied something called the two sleeps, first and second. The idea that people used to sleep in halves, that it was natural. Clara nodded. And now, we force ourselves through the night. Yes, he whispered. We stopped dreaming deeply. We lit our cities. We made the dark go away. And for a while, it lost us. But now we're here, in Willowby Lane. Oil lamps. Long nights. He looked at her gravely. We've made ourselves visible again. The next morning, another was gone. Mrs. Pendle, the widow who lived alone in the cottage past the mill. No signs of forced entry. Her bed neatly turned, hearth fire still warm, a slipper by the door. The townsfolk, stiff with fear and denial, buried the talk beneath practicalities. Perhaps she went to stay with her sister in Devon, muttered Amos. But no one believed it. Clara, now reading her father's notebook like scripture, traced the entries back further. It knows fire. It avoids iron. It vanishes when the line between sleeps is broken. But it is ancient. It adapts. In the margins, a warning. Do not stare into it. It reflects only what it has taken. She asked Penworthy that afternoon. Why hasn't anyone written about it, published it, warned others? He gave a bitter smile. They have. Only no one listens when it sounds like myth. And some are made to forget. That night, the hollow man returned. Clara had left the pouch burning again, this time in the window itself. The clean smoke curled up and out like incense. Her mother slept deeply, finally at peace, after Clara told her it was just an old nightmare. Come back. But Clara stayed awake. Just past 2, the lane darkened, as if the stars themselves had turned away. The hollow man stepped between hedges and shadows, trailing mist. No footsteps, no wind, just presence. He passed Amos Whitby's home, past the Rudge place. Then he stopped. Beneath Clara's window, she stood still, back pressed to the wall, breath held. A soft sound, like cloth dragging over stone. She dared to peek through the curtain. It looked different, no sharp her. Its outline more distinct. A long coat tattered, a head too narrow. Arms that dangled like ropes. It raised one hand and pointed at her window. The smoke wavered. Clara's heart thudded. The pouch was burning too low. She lunged for the herb bag and dumped the rest into the coals. The smoke surged, green and gold. The hollow man recoiled. It did not scream, it couldn't, but it shivered. Then it melted into the air. The next day, Clara and Mr. Penworthy met in secret behind the chapel. We have to do more than burn herbs, she said. We have to stop it for good. Penworthy rubbed his jaw. I believe your father may have tried. What do you mean? There was one page torn from the notebook. I think he removed it himself. Why? Because he tried to trap it, and I don't think he succeeded. Clara gripped the leather binding. Then we'll finish what he started. Penworthy stared at her. You're just a girl, Clara. Met his gaze, voice steady. It's watching us when we sleep. But we're watching it now. Clara kept the torn pouch of herbs under her pillow now. The scent lingered in her hair and her sheets, sharp and clinging, a comfort and a warning. Across the room, her mother stirred gently in her sleep, untroubled. But Clara remained upright, back against the wall, eyes on the shutters. She had not dreamed in 3 nights. Not proper dreams, anyway. Just flickers of memory, her father's voice, calling her name. The scent of tobacco from his coat, the scratch of his pencil against notebook paper. Each one faded too quickly to hold. Mr. Penworthy had begun assembling what he called a circle of watchers, quietly, carefully. Just those few who knew enough not to laugh. The Rudge boy, who'd woken screaming and couldn't remember why. The vicar's niece, who whispered about something pressing against her window at night. And Mrs. Elspeth Thornley, who'd once been a nurse in a lunatic asylum and hadn't flinched when Clara told her the hollow man had no face. They met in the back room of Penworthy's cottage, behind stacked crates of old medical journals. He laid out the facts like a war map. The creature comes only when the mind is deepest in sleep, he said. Between midnight and 3, always near the second sleep. Mrs. Thornley nodded. It preys in silence. That's why it survived. So long, there's no body, no blood. just absence. Clara held up the notebook. But it leaves something behind, a sort of echo. My father called it residue of soul. Penworthy added, if it's feeding, there must be a vessel. The Rudge boy shuddered. Like a mouth. No, said Clara softly. Like a wound. Their plan began with iron. Clara gathered scraps from the smithy's rubbish pile, nails, bent horseshoes, a length of rusted chain. Penworthy wired them into small charms, each one barely bigger than a coin. They hung them over doorways, under pillows, tied to windowsills. They carried them around their necks, and in coat pockets. The Hollow Man didn't come that night, nor the next, but sleep, even then, wasn't safe. Clara dreamed of an orchard that turned inside out, of her mother's voice repeating her name in a tone that wasn't hers, of mirrors with fog on both sides. She awoke, tangled in sheets, throat dry, the herb scent gone stale. Downstairs, she found a feather at the foot of the door, long, bone-white, warm to the touch. The sixth victim was discovered in the afternoon. Miss Orla Dunn, the baker's cousin. She'd gone missing from her bed some time before dawn. No noise, no sign of struggle. Just her boots still lined by the hearth, and one fingernail snapped short. Clara walked through town with Penworthy, and saw it for the first time, not fear, but something harder. Resentment. People were tired of not understanding, tired of whispered warnings and sleepless nights. When Clara passed Amos Whitby's wife on the lane, the woman narrowed her eyes and said, "It's you and your ghost stories keeping this thing alive." Clara didn't answer, because part of her wondered if it was true. That evening, Penworthy placed a heavy iron bowl on the cottage table. Inside were clippings of hair, waxed from 3 different candles, a crust of black bread, a thin scrap of paper with Clara's dream symbols drawn in ink. "I found the missing page," he said. Clara straightened. "Where? In your father's jacket lining, sewn inside." He must have hidden it when he realized the Hollow Man was growing stronger. The page was brittle, the writing smaller than the rest, as if every word had been a struggle to record. It cannot be killed, but it can be mirrored. It can be made to see itself. And that, it cannot survive. Beneath it, a diagram. A circle within a circle. A thread of fire surrounding a polished bowl. "Ritual magic," Penworthy whispered. "Old as bone." Mrs. Thornley raised an eyebrow. "You're suggesting we trick it into facing its own shadow?" Clara said no. "We're showing it what it left behind." The watchers gathered at midnight, behind the chapel, where the earth dipped low and trees crowded close enough to hush the wind. They dug a shallow ring, filled it with salt, laid iron charms at intervals. At the center, the bowl, polished until it gleamed like still water. Clara stood just beyond the salt line, her hands wrapped in her father's scarf. The air was thick. The smoke from the herb pouches curled upward, but never drifted far. It clung to their ankles and swirled around their chests. One by one, the others backed away, until Clara stood alone in the ring. She closed her eyes and waited. It came just past the stroke of 2, not with a scream or shriek, but with a stillness so profound that every owl stopped calling, and even the branches stopped swaying. The Hollow Man stepped between the trees. This time, it did not crawl or drift. It walked tall, bent at the shoulders, a coat that dragged leaves behind it. It moved with a purpose, its hands uncurled at its sides. Long and pale, the skin stretched too tight. Clara did not move, not even when it crossed the salt, not when it stopped a foot from her. It looked down at the bowl and saw itself. For the first time, there was no face to twist, no mouth to scream, but the entire form shuddered, rippling at the edges. Its outline flickered, as if the shape could no longer contain it. The bowl began to glow. The iron charms rang softly, and the Hollow Man reached forward, not to attack, to cover the bowl, to hide. Clara whispered, "You don't want to see." The figure twisted, jerking back. Its shape bent sideways, like a flame in wind. Then it burst apart, not in fire, not in blood, but in a rushing wind of silence and cold. It collapsed into itself, drawn into the image in the bowl, until only the reflection remained. Then even that vanished. Penworthy helped Clara step out of the circle. Mrs. Thornley crossed herself. The Rudge boy was crying, silently, fists balled at his sides. "It's done," Penworthy said. But Clara wasn't sure, not completely. She looked down into the bowl. Now empty, the water inside stilled, and at the very bottom faint, flickering, she saw her own face. Only the eyes didn't blink. Morning's light came slow, filtered through the gray-streaked clouds that hung above Willowby Lane like smoke from a fire that had not yet died. The town stirred with caution. Doors opened a crack. Eyes blinked toward the chapel hill. The earth there looked unchanged. No scorch marks, no grave, just a circle of churned soil and a bowl left cooling in the grass. Clara returned home with her father's, scarf still around her shoulders. Her mother met her on the front step, expression unreadable. "Tea," she said, guiding Clara by the arm. They sat in silence while the kettle boiled. After 3 sips, her mother finally said, "Did you see it?" Clara nodded. "I think it saw itself." And I think that was enough. Her mother's eyes didn't soften, but they no longer held fear. "Then we don't speak of it anymore." By midday, word spread that no one had vanished in the night. Not a child, not a widow, not even Mr. Varick, who often wandered the marsh in sleep. The town didn't rejoice. They didn't weep. They carried on. The black cloth over the baker's window came down. The bell at the schoolhouse rang again. Laundry flapped on lines as if nothing had ever gone wrong, and yet everything had shifted. People stepped a little more lightly, looked behind them, once more before locking doors. The watchers kept meeting, at first, not to fight, but to remember. Mrs. Thornley wrote a full account of their efforts and tucked it into the church's ledger. Penworthy catalogued the charms, sealing them in labeled pouches for future use, and Clara kept the bowl. Not as a trophy, as a warning. A week passed. Then another dreams returned, but normal ones, silly, vivid, and harmless. Her father walked through them sometimes, always standing just out of reach, always smiling faintly. He never spoke, but that was fine. She had memorized his voice. One morning, as she sorted through his journal, she found a folded scrap tucked beneath the back cover. It was a receipt from a general store in Leicester. Ink faded, but legible, at the bottom. In her father's tight scrawl, "Herbs can't hold darkness, only delay it. The only true weapon is remembrance." Clara stared at the words for a long while that night. She burned the last of the herb pouches in the fireplace. Spring came slow, but steady. The trees bloomed with new leaves, brighter than the year before. The sky opened wider. Nights stayed quiet. Still, Clara didn't sleep the same way. She never returned to the 2-sleep rhythm her family once followed. She slept once, deeply, all the way through, as if claiming back what had been taken. When she awoke, it was to birdsong, or her mother's humming, not the sound of claws, not a whisper behind the walls. The hollow man was gone, but the world hadn't forgotten him, and neither had Clara. One warm afternoon, Clara visited the schoolhouse to speak with Miss Irwin, who'd returned to her lessons and took great pride in correcting grammar and posture. "I never believed in ghosts," Miss Irwin admitted over a paper cup of tea. Clara smiled faintly. "Still don't." Miss Irwin's brow tightened. "I believe in fear, and I believe in sleep. And those two things have always been dangerous neighbors." She sipped again. "And I believe you saved this town." Clara shook her head. "I didn't." "Then who?" Clara looked out the window. A group of children chased a hoop down the lane, laughing. "Everyone who stayed awake when it mattered," she said. Mr. Penworthy left Willowby Lane shortly after the thaw. He packed his belongings into a cart, taking nothing but books and a few locked boxes. "I've been summoned to Wrexham," he told Clara as he tightened the reins. "Something strange is happening with the wells there. Black water, odd dreams, familiar signs." Clara handed him a sealed parcel. Inside were 5 of the iron charms, a pouch of salt, and a copy of her father's notes. "Then don't start from scratch," she said. Penworthy touched his hat. "You're wiser than most, twice your age." She watched him until the cart disappeared past the hedgerows. He never returned. Mrs. Thornley passed in her sleep during the summer, at peace, her hands folded over her chest. Her nephew found a note beneath her pillow, written in careful script. The hollow man only comes when no one watches. Her funeral was quiet. Clara placed a single nail one of their old iron charms at the foot of her grave. "Thank you for believing," she whispered. Years went by. Clara grew. She studied medicine, first in London, then abroad. She never married, though she received proposals. Her name appeared in journals, often attached to theories about the intersection of sleep and illness. When asked what had drawn her to the field, she never offered the full truth. Just this: "I had a reason not to sleep once." And those who looked closer sometimes found a single bowl polished steel. Simple, ordinary, always on the shelf behind her desk. And sometimes, when the nights were unusually still, when the wind carried no sound and the lamps guttered low, Clara would wake from dreams she never remembered. And in the edge of her vision, just before waking, she thought she saw something reflected in the bowl. Something tall and watching, but never again did it cross the threshold, because she was ready, and she would always remember. In the third year after the hollow man vanished, the town of Willowby Lane held a festival. They didn't call it that, exactly. There was no banner, no dancing in the square. But on the first day of autumn, neighbors set tables outside. They brought preserves, fresh loaves, and jars of late honey. Mr. Abbott roasted a pig in the old style, and Mrs. Greeley passed out slices of spiced apple cake wrapped in cloth. Children wore garlands of wheat and wool, and no one mentioned why Clara returned from London, just in time to see it. She stepped off the coach, wearing a dark blue coat and wire-rimmed spectacles, a notebook under one arm, and boots coated in the dust of city streets. A few of the children called her doctor, though she corrected them gently. "Not yet," she said with a smile, "still learning." Miss Irwin found her by the chapel steps. "You look taller," she remarked. Clara raised an eyebrow. "I've been eating more vegetables, and using words most of us can't pronounce." Clara laughed. "Fair enough." They sat on the grass and watched the clouds gather over the distant hills. The town around them was whole. The chapel had a new roof. The school had new desks. But something else had changed. Something harder to name. Willowby Lane no longer looked inward. It looked ahead. Clara stayed a week, visiting old friends, reading through her father's journals, once more, and helping her mother rearrange the kitchen. She gave away her city sweets to the neighborhood children, and listened with interest as young George Thatcher told her about a new creature he'd seen in the woods. "It had eyes like stars," he whispered, "and it didn't walk, it floated." Clara knelt beside him. "What did you do?" George puffed out his chest. "I threw a walnut at it. Then I ran home. Good instincts." She pressed a silver coin into his palm. "Next time, take notes." The day before she left, Clara visited the chapel hill where the hollow man had once appeared. There was no trace of what had happened, no marks, no bowl. She had taken that with her. But a new stone stood there, now short, rough-edged, carved with names. Not of the dead, but the living. The Watchers: Penworthy, Thornley, Irwin, Little George, hers, others. At the base, someone had written, "We stayed awake." Clara traced the letters with one gloved hand. "I'll keep watching," she promised. Then she stood, adjusted her scarf, and walked back into town. Back in London, her life resumed with the quiet discipline of study. Long hours at the hospital, later ones at the library. She specialized in parasomnia disorders of sleep. Her colleagues dismissed her ideas at first. But then the letters started arriving. From Wrexham, from Devon, from a distant farm outside Dresden. Dreams, sleepwalking, strange silences. Whole families waking with no memory of what passed between dusk and dawn. Each account different, but some patterns were the same, Clara wrote. Back to every one, sometimes with medical advice, sometimes with a recipe for a charm, and sometimes just a single sentence: "Stay awake. Watch the corners." One gray winter morning, she received a package wrapped in oilcloth, with no return address. Inside, a cracked mirror, a ribbon tied with chicken bones, and a photograph of a girl with her eyes closed, surrounded by standing still as gravestones. On the back, 3 words. It followed again. Clara closed the lid and locked it in the drawer with the others. Not because she was afraid, because she was preparing. In the 10th year, after the Hollow Man vanished, Clara returned to Willowby Lane again. This time she came with colleagues, doctors, historians, one wary professor of folklore, who wore gloves, even in the summer. They stayed a month, taking notes and mapping symbols, long buried in cellar walls. They studied the sleep patterns of townsfolk and the histories of other disappearances across Britain. But the nights were peaceful. The Chapel Hill was quiet when they left. The townspeople gave Clara a small wooden box filled with clippings from the Old Town Gazette, a lump of salt, and one of the iron charms from her youth. She kept it in her coat pocket. And then, one night, years later, in a town far from any map, Clara heard her own voice echoing back from the dark. It came not from a dream, but from the space just before waking. She was in a small rented house, windows latched, a lamp burning low, and in the stillness she heard it, her own voice, saying, "Don't sleep through this one." She opened her eyes slowly. Something was wrong, not in the room, not in the air, but in the silence. She stood. The shadows in the corner shifted, ever so slightly. She reached into her drawer, pulled out the old polished bowl, and placed it on the bedside table. Then she whispered, "I see you," and whatever. Waited in the dark it stilled. Clara lit the second candle. The shadows recoiled slightly. Not fled, not gone, but thinner now, as if light unspooled their shape. Her room was lined with wards stitched into cloth, and charms cast in iron, but it was the bowl that steadied her hands. She poured water from the ceramic pitcher and watched the surface settle. Then she began to speak. Not a prayer, not a warning. A story she told. The empty room of Willowby Lane, of the watchers, of the Hollow Man's long fingers tapping glass panes in winter. She spoke of broken sleep and whispered names and hands clasped together in vigil. And then she said, firmly, "We saw you." The shadow stilled. Its edge curled back like paper set near flame. From the corner, the figure resolved, not a man, but not quite unshaped. Its face shifted every time she blinked. A woman she had known as a child. Her father's silhouette, the pockmarked face of a scholar from her lectures. It wore familiarity like a cloak. She didn't flinch. "You came, once," she said, "to test the edge. You found us sleeping." The figure didn't reply, but something passed through the air, like the crackle of ice breaking. "You won't find us sleeping again." Clara's voice was low. "Sure, I've taught others to watch. They light lamps in barns and wards and gardens. I've written guidebooks. No one reads twice, and yet they keep them. I've buried bowls under doorsteps and charms in chimneys. I've spread your name to people who've never heard of Willowby Lane." She stood, "And we are not afraid." The figure shrank. A hiss, not air, but time itself wrinkled the quiet. Then, as if the whole room exhaled, the figure folded in on itself. Gone. Clara slept the next night, with one candle still burning. When she woke, the water in the bowl was still. The silence had changed. It no longer pressed. It listened. Outside, frost clung to the windows. She rose, made tea, and pulled her old notebook from the shelf. There were new letters to answer reports from Estonia, from Chile, from an isolated abbey in the Orkney Islands. Each told of sleep. Disturbed, but they didn't sound afraid. They sounded ready. In Willowby Lane, the old watchers grew older. Miss Irwin walked with a cane, though she refused to call it that. George Thatchern, now George the baker, kept a charm above his oven, and swore the smell of cinnamon kept them things away. Mr. Penworthy had passed on, but his nephew kept his journals bound in copper wire, and read them aloud each spring. And, though the Hollow Man never returned, they still watched. Not every night, but on the equinox, and on the first frost. And whenever a child said they dreamed of faces they'd never met, the watchers would gather. They would sit quietly, and they would stay awake. 20 years passed. Clara became a scholar, known only in whispered circles, not famous, but remembered. They called her the waking woman in some places. In others, simply the lantern. She traveled often, sometimes with a satchel of instruments, sometimes with only a charm and a flame. There were places in the world where the shadows moved differently, older places, deeper than memory. She kept maps, drew lines, took samples of ash and teeth and stones that bled salt when broken. But always, she returned to Willoughby Lane, and each time, she brought something, a charm, a page of theory, a drawing made by a child who swore they'd seen something impossible. She left these in the chapel's crypt. Over time, others added to it. An archive was born. They called it the Watch Room, on the 50th anniversary of the first vigil. Clara stood once more on the chapel hill. She was not young anymore. Her hair was iron gray, and her fingers curled slightly from years of ink and cold. But she stood tall. Around her stood dozens. Some wore scholars' robes. Others carried lanterns. A few wore no shoes, in honor of the first watchers. And among them were children, some wide-eyed, some sleepy. A girl with a slingshot in her belt asked, "Will it come back tonight?" Clara considered. "I don't know," she answered honestly. "But if it does," she looked over the gathering, "we're ready." That night, the town did not sleep. The candles burned. The bowls were filled. And in every corner of every home, someone watched, not with fear, but with remembrance, with strength, with knowing, and far off. Wherever the hollow man had gone, if it still stirred, if it still wandered the borders of waking and dream, it would have seen them, and it would have turned away.